And when I planned to acknowledge Ramadan today, I had no idea our world would be reeling from the invasion of Iran that threatens ever greater instability in the Middle East. I wanted to design a service that promotes pluralism and lift up a little-known history of collaborative religious efforts under a liberal Muslim regime that lasted from the 8th to the 14th century in what today is Spain. The lessons of that time seem all the more significant now that the Mideast is consumed in a regional war and when intolerance seems to be on the rise in many nations, including our own. But before sharing this history, I want to lift up someone who to me is the most inspiring Muslim activist that I've personally encountered, Rami Nashashibi. Rami is a Palestinian-American, a community organizer, sociologist, and Islamic studies scholar here in Chicago. He says we currently have a practical framework for American resistance, but now we need a spiritual one. He offers a morally compelling and spiritually grounded approach to organizing that he calls the 4 Ds and the 4 Rs. He calls us to engage in the 4 Ds and cultivate the 4 Rs, and that is to disrupt so that moral resonance ripples forth, to delegitimize, to reignite the moral and spiritual flame that sustains organizing, to cause deflections that bring forth the reclamation of conscience that turns insiders into allies, and to develop alternatives that come from radical reimagination. To radically reimagine is to remember that our sacred traditions expand our sense of what is possible. Radical reimagination fuels cooperative economies, creative sanctuaries, and artistic interventions that refuse to capitulate to evil. I will have more to share about Rami Nashashibi in time, but right now I want to go back to the 8th century, to Andalusia. Most people think of the Middle Ages as a time of feudal infighting where human progress stagnated, but not in Andalusia, which covered much of what would become Spain. For in this land that called itself Al-Andalus, a little-known Renaissance flourished centuries before the well-known Renaissance in the rest of Europe. Discoveries in astronomy, trigonometry, surgery, pharmacology, and irrigation were made among this unusually civilized people. And I say civilized because Al-Andalus was governed by a highly tolerant sect of Muslims who recognized that progress comes with collaboration, not conformity. Collaboration among Muslims, Jews, and Christians is what makes this chapter of human history remarkable. Tolerance was for them a song of peace and a means to progress. For the intellectuals and leaders of all 3 religious traditions saw no contradiction in pursuing the truth, whether religious or scientific or philosophical, across the boundaries of their distinct faith traditions. That's why science flourished here unlike anywhere else in the Middle Ages. That's why the Greek philosophers were translated into Arabic as a multi-faith collaboration, which literally saved many works for posterity. And the Jewish community flourished. Unless you're familiar with Jewish history, you may be unaware that the greatest chapter of Jewish flourishing in Europe was during this time in Al-Andalus, where secular Hebrew poetry was developed, where scientific and rigorous study of the Hebrew Bible began, and where many Jews served in the diplomatic corps of the Muslim-led civilization. And there were also breakthroughs in architecture. slides, which I would love to show you, but I was just a little bit too late. Now, this extraordinary chapter of human history, the story of this extraordinary chapter ended in tragedy. Actually, it began in tragedy as well. The year was 750. Now I know we're getting to 11 o'clock, and if you need to leave, I'm not going to take offense. But I spent a lot of time on this, and I'm going to share it. To those of you who are willing to stay. So the year was 750, 120 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. There were essentially 4 schools of Islam, each claiming to be the legitimate one. The Umayyad sect was in power, and they were the most culturally engaged sect. They had just moved their capital from Medina to Damascus. The Abbasids, another sect and far, far less tolerant, the Abbasids murdered almost the entire Umayyad royal family. A 19-year-old Umayyad prince survived, who happened not to be there. His name was Abd al-Rahman. He fled from Damascus through Morocco and then north across the Mediterranean and inland to a very small Muslim city called Cordoba. Given his royal heritage, he was regarded as a successor of Muhammad and was quickly made the head of the city. 30 years later, the city was flourishing and welcomed Jews and Christians who wanted to live there. Within 2 centuries, it would become the largest city in Europe, the center of scientific and philosophical learning, and where music and art flourished. Cordoba was the hub of cultural and intellectual flourishing from 930 to 1050. And all of this occurred because tolerance and collaboration. Andalusia, the first great civilization where interfaith collaboration occurred, mutual respect for the truths of science, the first great example of pluralism that made space for the human spirit to innovate in multiple ways. How I wish this history was more well known. An example of what's possible when tolerance is practiced. Now, I know tolerance as a concept doesn't sound all that great. I will tolerate you sounds rather condescending. But I appreciate how the great Unitarian historian Earl Morse Wilbur noted the threefold foundation of liberal religion are freedom, reason, and generous tolerance. Generous tolerance of differing religious views and usages rather than insistence upon uniformity in doctrine, worship, or polity. And I've heard fellow Unitarian Universalists suggest that tolerance is not enough, that we need acceptance of all people and all beliefs. Yes and no. Absolutely, acceptance of all people, but not all beliefs. Not all truth claims are equal. There are some beliefs and truth claims that must be resisted, particularly those that dismiss the inherent dignity of some and seek to prevent their flourishing. I cringe when I hear someone say, "Oh, we Unitarian Universalists, we can believe whatever we want." No, you can't believe anything you want. You can believe anything you must. Brad Stetson writes in The Truth About Tolerance that tolerance allows people the liberty and personal freedom of self-determination, promotes the free exchange of ideas, including criticism and debate of public policy in the interest of the people, sustains civic order by promoting its ongoing criticism, analysis, debate, and improvement by the people, and in the best cases, for the people. In a word, tolerance is the virtue that makes peace possible. Doesn't make tolerance any easier. It's hard. It's hard to remain tolerant of people who claim and apparently honestly believe that white men are the real victims in contemporary America. It's hard not to get utterly exasperated and cynical and simply to withdraw. Our faith tradition calls upon us to not give over the keys to our own authority. If we get so angry and that we throw up our hands and don't do anything, we have lost. If we get so upset that we demean the worth and dignity of other human beings that we disagree with, then we are even more lost. As I mentioned, the story of Andalusia ends in tragedy and utter intolerance. 1492, that year we associate with Christopher Columbus, was the very first day of that year, the very last bastion of Islamic heritage was ceded to Queen Isabella, and that was the Alhambra in Granada. And on March 31st, 1492, 6 months before Columbus sailed, Queen Isabella decreed that all Jews must leave Spain within 3 months or be killed. This expulsion of the Jews marked the tragic end of a brilliant chapter of human culture and history, and the Spanish Inquisition would stifle intellectual and cultural progress for centuries. Now, on this 8th day of a war that our nation and Israel launched on a horrifically autocratic Muslim country, I lift up the virtue of tolerance as a song of peace. But the song of peace gets stamped out when tyrants are left unchecked. I mean, a lot of us call our president a tyrant, and he behaves that way. But quite honestly, some of the Iran's president has been truly, the supreme leader has been a true tyrant. Let me just say, all tyrants need to be resisted. Because we're in a democracy, we shall inevitably deal with opinions much different from our own. And looking closely at what is going on, I find hope. I find hope that at Jesse Jackson's memorial service, 2 rabbis, a Catholic priest, the president of the nation of Colombia, all joined 3 presidents, several missionary Baptist ministers, and even a Palestinian American spoke, sharing his story of how he was on Jesse Jackson's staff for 40 years. And at the beginning of that term, he said, "I should not do this because it's going to prevent you from being successful." And he says, "No, I want you. I insist you stay." Jackson reached out to Arab American leaders in the 80s. He reached out to gay and lesbian leaders in the 80s. He reached out to indigenous people. He forged a rainbow coalition that has had such significant influence on the wider society. And I was so moved by this memorial service, including by the sharing of Reverend Otis Moss III of Trinity United Church of Christ. He shared how, as the son of a pastor very involved in civil rights, he spent a lot of time with Jesse Jackson growing up. He said, "We honor the son of the South, practitioner of good trouble and acolyte of holy mischief. We honor a spiritual artist who painted upon the canvas of democracy with a rainbow coalition of colors that had been marginalized by antebellum myths that dismissed human dignity. We honor the rhetorical genius of a man whose oral dexterity had the ability to reshape notions of what is possible. The simple phrase, "I am somebody," when deployed by Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson, empowered a generation suffering from the effects of the lingering residue left by Confederate bacteria resting upon the unrealized constitutional promises in this space called America. This prophet offered the world a moral imagination forged by the creative brilliance of the Black church tradition. May we honor him by daring to keep hope alive. May we honor him by daring to speak truth to power. May we honor him by daring to call out corruption, moral malfeasance, political narcissism, autocratic action, authoritarian behavior, and cult-like oligarch spirits masquerading as civic duty. May we honor him by daring to be a people united to save humanity. And I would add, may the Black church tradition continue to inspire and forge prophets for our time. And may other traditions recognize the truth of their teachings. And may Jesse Jackson rest in peace. And I find hope in the interfaith collaboration that I have recently joined here in Illinois. It is called Faith Over Fear, co-founded by Otis Moss III and Rami Nashashibi. It was co-founded by Father Michael Flager, a Catholic priest willing to speak truth to power and serve a most challenged neighborhood on the Chicago's South Side. And it was co-founded by Reverend Sierra Bates Chamberlain, who leads Live Free Illinois. I want to end with an insight from Maya Angelou's magnificently hopeful poem titled, "Still I Rise." Her insight is that hardship itself creates the possibility for hope. Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. I rise. I rise. May we all rise. Blessed be. Amen.
Visit us at uusg.org.